Hello and welcome to Press Review. I'm Carmen Cracknell. Today we'll be taking a look at the ongoing Syrian conflict as we talk to political analyst Hassan AlKatib. We also take a look at Palestine and Israel in light of Nelson Mandela's death. But first, let's take a look at the UK papers. The Times leads its front page reporting on Nelson Mandela's memorial event with the headline, "Crowd hails Mandela but bury his successor," describing Mr. Mandela's successor Jacob Zuma being subjected to global humiliation as the crowd booed when he appeared on screens inside the stadium venue. It also features a picture of David Cameron, Barack Obama and Danish Prime Minister Helle Thorning-Schmidt taking a selfie at the memorial, and reports on the government's climate change advisory body saying Britain should press ahead with fracking. The Telegraph leads its front page reporting on David Cameron announcing an Alzheimer's breakthrough and pledging to lead a global fight back against dementia as concerns grow that patients are being neglected. It also features a picture of Obama, Cameron and Thorning-Schmidt as they are pictured taking a selfie, describing Mrs. Obama appearing unamused. The Independent leads its front page reporting that the case involving billionaire Labour donor Victor Dahdaleh, accused of paying more than £35 million in bribes to Bahraini businessmen, has been dropped. It also features a picture of mourners from Mandela's funeral. The Guardian leads its front page reporting on Ofsted, saying that the uneven quality of schools across the country means England is divided into unlucky and lucky children, and poverty is no longer a predictor of educational failure. Like all other papers, it also takes a look at Mandela's memorial service, saying of the 91 world leaders present, there was only one who made everyone stop and listen, referring to Barack Obama, as it pictures Mandela's widow with the US president. Now let's take a look at the top stories in the Middle East. A blog post published by James Denslow on Al Majalla titled "The US Cavalry is Not Coming" talks about the US role in Syria and the lack of a clear US strategy towards the region. According to the author, a story by the renowned US investigative journalist Seymour Hersh claimed to show US policy on Syria in its most reactive light to date. Hersh claims, based largely on off-the-record interviews with US defense officials, that the Obama administration had cherry-picked intelligence surrounding the sarin gas attack in Damascus in August. According to Hersh's report, the US knew that the radical al-Nusra Front also had access to such weapons, but that the regime was blamed as part of a decision to intervene militarily against it. This decision was then undermined by lack of international support and domestic opposition in the States that led the US to embrace the face-saving agreement to disarm Syria's chemical weapons stockpile. The author writes, "Sadly, Hersh's story is unlikely to be corroborated and may join the increasingly long list of shadowy stories concerning US intelligence and Middle East weapons," adding that the US has no clearly articulated set of goals with regards to Syria. Speaking of the Arab Spring, the author writes, "At the start it was described as a revolution, and Washington's interference could have easily become a hindrance, but as the war dragged on, the US public withdrew interest." Travis Gettys wrote a piece for The Raw Story titled "White House Scoffs at Seymour Hersh Claims that Obama Lied About Syrian WMDs," regarding the new report that claims the Obama administration manipulated intelligence reports to support its case for military intervention in Syria. In a quote from his report in the London Review of Books, Seymour said, "In some instances, President Barack Obama omitted important intelligence, and in others, he presented assumptions as facts." Seymour added, "Most significant, he failed to acknowledge something known to the US intelligence community, that the Syrian army is not the only party in the country's civil war with access to sarin." The author wrote that a former senior intelligence official told Hersh that the Obama administration had altered the timing and sequence of some available information to give the appearance that it had been picked up and analysed in real time as the attack happened. The circumstances were likened to those that occurred when the US reversed the sequence of intelligence intercepts to justify one of the early bombings in North Vietnam. Gessis added that documents leaked by Edward Snowden formed the basis of a Washington Post report that revealed a secret sensor system that monitored the status of Syria's chemical weapons arsenal, but Hirsch reports that the sensors detected no movement in the months or days before the August 21st attack. Gessis concluded Hirsch reported that the Obama administration buried reports that the jihadi group al-Nusra had mastered the mechanics of creating sarin and was capable of making bulk quantities of the deadly chemical agent. Now we're joined by political analyst Hassan AlKatib. Thank you for joining us today, Hassan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, thank you.
In light of the report published by Seymour Hersh regarding the US cherry-picking information on Syria, do you think the US could mix up other facts to stage an intervention?
Yes, of course. Seymour Hersh is one of the most respected investigative journalists in America, and he's come up with a very important report stating that the Obama administration knew about the fact that the rebels had possessed chemical weapons, and they could have very easily used that in the attack in Ghouta in August 2013. And in fact, what they've been doing, not only in Syria, but in many other countries, they've used certain opinions or facts on the ground, some which have not actually been verified at all, and they've used it in order to advance their own interests in that region. We saw that with Iraq. They've talked about weapons of mass destruction there. There wasn't any evidence there, and what happens is that many countries, superpowers such as America, will not go under international law. They won't. They'll do whatever they want to. So they have their interests in that region, and they want to further those interests, and they will overlook certain evidences. They'll try to push certain evidences in order to try and further their agenda.
Yeah, but given the lack of clear US strategy in the region, what would be the motivations for a US intervention?
Well, firstly, America had a clear strategy on Syria, and that was to try and topple the government in order to replace it with a government which was pro-Western and pro-American. And of course, that strategy hasn't worked. So they're trying to come up with Plan B, Plan C, etc. And at the moment, what we're seeing right now in the last few months is, the American government who try to push for war in Syria, who try to bomb Syrian targets in order to weaken the Syrian government and turn the whole dynamics on top of its head. It tried to influence the war and the civil war that was going on, but that failed, and they couldn't do that. So now they've pretty much understood that Russia, Iran, and other countries are really standing by the Syrian government, and they really can't, change the power dynamics on the ground at the moment. So they're coming up with different strategies. They want to prolong, of course, this civil war as much as they can, so that they can weaken the Syrian government as much as possible. But they've realized that if they allow the war to continue, the Syrian government will make a lot of gains. So I think that's why they want to sort of sit at the table with Russia, with Iran, and with other countries to try and the Syrian government's gains that they've made in the region, and to try and make some sort of peaceful accord so that the fighting will. But that, again, is going to be clear in January in Geneva too, when the meeting superpowers will be held there with Iran and other countries. That's when it will be clear. But right now, at this moment, we're still unclear of what America is hoping to do in Syria at the moment. They still want to try and further their other, aspects of their interests in that particular.
You mentioned Plan B and C. What do you think that the US might do as the war drags on?
Well, they're monitoring the situation closely. They hoped that the civil war will try and put breakthroughs and try to, make the Assad government, have a lot of if you like, compromises, but that didn't happen. And at the moment, as we'll see in a month's time, just over a month's time, what deal will be made. They've made a big deal with Iran very recently about their nuclear program, and I think at the moment U.S. interests are starting to turn. Their foreign policy in the whole region, in Syria and the Middle East, is also starting because they found that they can't continue just blindly supporting Israel and Saudi Arabia in the region, because that's harming their interests now, and they've come across that quite clearly. So what they're trying to do is to maintain some of their own interests, but by trying to have these compromises with Russia, with Iran, because there is a big struggle right now over resources inside Syria. There's this whole idea of gas and oil exports being used through Syria. This is something which America had wanted to try and galvanize, but that hasn't worked. So they're trying to limit, if you like, the damage that is happening towards their own interests in order to try and break deals. So right now it's pretty much a situation whereby America and other countries are sitting down at the table to try and pull off certain deals in order to try and, if you like, still help their own interests in some way or another. But that, again, as I said, will be clear in a month's time or in a few months' time. At the moment, America has shifted their strategy and shifted their foreign policy, and it's starting to turn, and we're seeing that. And it could be a huge turning point in history. So we'll hopefully going to see that in the next few months.
Thank you so much for your time, Hasan.
Thank you.
In the light of Nelson Mandela's memorial and Netanyahu not attending, let's take a look at what analysts are saying about Palestine and Israel. Israel's Haaretz newspaper features an editorial titled "Netanyahu's Symbolic Absence," as it says Israel is gradually being evicted from the international community because of its insistence on continuing the occupation. The paper says Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has decided to start curtailing his exorbitant expenditures, which are publicised from time to time and generally spark public outrage. But it's too bad that the very first cut he opted to make resulted in Nelson Mandela's funeral. It adds that given the generous budget for travel and other expenditures that has characterised all of Netanyahu's terms as Prime Minister, just last year, for instance, he insisted on flying in a specially chartered plane to the funeral of former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. And given that Mandela's doctrine and legacy, in contrast to those of Thatcher, are evidently not the pillar of fire that guides Netanyahu, it's not unreasonable to suspect that the spending issue provided Netanyahu with a pretext to escape a vexing event he didn't want to participate in. The paper says Israel under Netanyahu's leadership, in which segregation, racist legislation and discrimination on the basis of nationality are flourishing virtually undisturbed, cannot say it respects Mandela's heritage, nor can it join the family of nations whose flagship values are the striving for civil equality and the fight against racism. The paper notes Mandela spoke out in the past in favour of the Palestinian struggle, something that earned him no points with Netanyahu, who sees the Palestinians as demonic enemies with whom there is no possibility of dialogue. Another point it notes is that it's also possible to infer that's the core of Mandela's struggle. The war on racism against blacks doesn't burn in the Israeli Prime Minister's bones, since just this week Netanyahu and his coalition partners were busy passing the so-called infiltration law, which allows people to be jailed for up to a year without trial and is aimed primarily at African migrants. The article concludes that the absence of Israel's senior leadership from Mandela's funeral is no accident, and it can be seen as a symbol of Israel's increasing diplomatic isolation. Israel is gradually being evicted from the international community because of its insistence on continuing the occupation and even reinforcing it via more and more settlements, while turning its back on diplomatic processes and initiatives. Roger Fowler writes an opinion piece for the New Zealand Herald titled "Apartheid Still Reigns in Palestine." Fowler compares South Africa and Israel, saying both the apartheid system in South Africa and the State of Israel were set up soon after World War II in 1948. Both installed brutal dictatorial regimes that enforced ethnic-based privilege and cruel racial oppression, yet both enjoyed huge support from the big Western powers and collusion with multinational businesses, but condemnation from the UN and other agencies, and the emerging worldwide civil movements striving for social justice. Fowler adds, however, history shows that no state of oppression, no matter how fierce, can last forever. Oppression breeds resistance and its own eventual demise. Israel's days of oppression are numbered. Revered by Palestinians, Nelson Mandela declared, "We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." He told journalist John Pilger that justice of the Palestinians had become the greatest moral issue of our time. Fowler notes that former Israeli Prime Minister Olmert once admitted in an interview with Haaretz, if the day comes when the two-state solution collapses and we face a South African-style struggle for equal voting rights, then as soon as that happens, the State of Israel is finished. He adds that although the brutal Israeli regime can appear to be very powerful, estimated to be the world's fourth greatest military might with its huge arsenal of US-supplied state-of-the-art weaponry and hundreds of nuclear warheads, it is becoming increasingly isolated and friendless. Fowler also adds that global solidarity for the struggle against apartheid invoked effective strategies of protest, boycotts, divestment and sanctions to isolate South Africa. The Palestinians have called for similar peaceful measures to help bring about the end of their plight. Fowler recalls Archbishop Tutu, who visited occupying Palestine, saying that the racist oppression, humiliation and collective punishment he witnessed was much worse than the darkest days of apartheid in South Africa. America's Global Post correspondent in Jerusalem writes, "Why did Israel snub Mandela? 3 questions with our correspondent." Global Post senior correspondent in Jerusalem, Noga Tarnopolsky, assesses what the news sites refer to as Bibi's cringeworthy antics, saying despite a history of fraught relations between South Africa and Israel, Israel's government had no real problem with Nelson Mandela's state funeral. The problem lies in the personality of Prime Minister Netanyahu and in the incompetence of his staff. Tarnopolsky notes that when Mandela's death was announced, Netanyahu issued an immediate statement of mourning. Ceremonial head of state and President Shimon Peres said in a separate statement that he would represent Israel at the funeral. From that moment on, the saga, or the fiasco, has snowballed to preposterous proportions. First, Netanyahu declared that in fact he would attend Mandela's funeral. The president's office, which had already sent a 5-person advance team to South Africa, was forced to take a step back. She then notes 36 hours before the funeral, and without coordinating with the president's office or any other body, Netanyahu changed his mind and declared he wouldn't be attending Mandela's funeral due to the prohibitive cost of organising last-minute travel. The trip would have cost an estimated $2 million. She also highlights Netanyahu's spending habits, who has recently faced a spate of criticism for his love of Cuban cigars, his predilection for sipping cognac, for having spent almost $2,000 a year on scented candles, and $2,700 on his favourite ice cream. Last April, for no reason any Israeli could understand, Netanyahu spent almost $450,000 in public funds, including $127,000 on a private sleeping chamber, so that he and his wife Sarah could attend Margaret Thatcher's funeral in London, adding that this latest stumble had left Israelis stunned. Speaking on why was this decision so sensitive for Israel's government, Tarnopolsky points out that Israel was one of a few countries that in the 70s and 80s sold weapons to the apartheid regime in South Africa, for which many South Africans have never forgiven Israel. In addition, in the post-Mandela era, successive South African governments have attacked Israel for its oppression of the Palestinians, who always stood by South African blacks fighting for equality, often drawing close comparisons between the predicaments of the two peoples. Tarnopolsky says the consensus here is that this is just the latest example of Netanyahu's personal gracelessness and lack of ability to gauge international reaction to his behaviour, and the tin ear and clumsiness of his staff. It's pretty much impossible for Netanyahu to justify his antics to the public, no matter what the reason. She finally points out that in an interview with Israel Radio, Zev Krengel, a South African Jewish leader, deplored the fact that Netanyahu's spurious reason for the last-minute cancellation plays into the old anti-Semitic stereotype that Jews are stingy. Now let's take a look at the top headlines from international papers. UAE's Gulf News leads with the headline, GCC call to end Syria's human catastrophe. The Washington Post leads its front page with the headline, House-Senate negotiators reach deal on budget as an $85 billion agreement is unveiled. Russia's Moscow Times leads its front page with the headline, Lawmakers vow to support amnesty. And finally, China's Global Times leads its front page with the headline, Meeting sets economic goals. For more updates, please visit levant.tv. Join Carl tomorrow as he brings you another press review. Until then, it's bye from me.